Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all well. Maybe somebody could just give me a wave to let me know that you can hear me okay. Oh, brilliant. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody to the fourth session now in our Charnwood Forest Species Identification and Recording project. So just a quick reminder to everybody that we are recording the session so that it will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you can please make sure you're on mute. That just helps us to avoid any background noise. Obviously, when it gets to the question session at the end, feel free to unmute to ask your questions. You're perfectly free to have your video on or off, but just remember we are being recorded. As before, we'll have a question and answer session at the end, so feel free to save them up or pop them in the chat box. Just note that I can't necessarily see the chat box as we're going along, so I will pick that up at the end. As before, again, we'll hopefully finish by around 2 o'clock and hope you all enjoy the session. So the aims of the session, as before, just a quick run over of the wider partnership scheme that we're part of and a bit of the kind of background for why we're doing this project. And then the main session today is all about hedgerows. So I hope that's what you were expecting when you signed up. We'll be talking about structure of hedgerows, their function, and then taking a run through some of the species you're likely to find in our hedgerows out in the wider countryside. At the end, there'll be a bit of a link to some resources, and we've done a spotter sheet for you, as for the previous sessions, but that'll be available to download, so we'll be able to send a link out to that. And we'll have time for questions, as I said. So I'm sure some of you will have seen this before, but I do just want to reiterate we're part of a wider landscape partnership scheme for the Charnwood Forest. And if you haven't had the chance to watch it, do pop onto our website and listen to it's only a 5-minute or so video from Julie Attard, and she manages the whole scheme, and she gives you a really good picture of what's going on and where this project, where this kind of presentation sits within the Charnwood Forest Landscape Partnership Scheme. But we've set this project up because wildlife recording is a really essential management tool. And it helps us to understand what's going on with our habitats and our species and whether we need to change what we're doing, how we're managing things. It's a great way to learn some new skills, to get out, meet people. I think it's a really enjoyable, hopefully, activity to undertake. And as a result of this session and the future sessions that we're going to be putting on over the next few years, what we're hoping is that people will gain the skills and become confident in being able to get out and about, notice what is around them, and then be able to actually record what is around them and be able to then submit those records so that we can increase what we know about the Charnwood Forest area. So hopefully we'll have some new recorders and potentially some new groups. So we'll explore whether there's like-minded people who are interested in particular species or particular sites. And that's something we're going to be starting to pick up early in 2022. So early next year, we'll be starting to talk about where should we be going and what exactly do we want to be looking for. But in the meantime, we're running through some of the kind of the introductory sessions at the moment that everybody can listen along with and hopefully just be inspired to start understanding a bit more about particular species and being able to just start that identification journey or continue it and get a bit of a refresher for those that already feel as though they kind of know a fair bit as we go along. So as I said, hedgerows today, structure, function and species, hedgerows in the landscape. We probably all wander past them or drive around and you see them all the time, but I thought it'd be useful to kick off with a bit of a definition. What is a hedgerow and what is not a hedgerow? And this comes from the Hedgerow regulations in 1997. So this is a regulation that we have, and I'll touch a bit more on why that's important later on in the presentation. But the hedgerow regulations define a hedgerow as any boundary line of trees or shrubs. So we're talking a boundary, they're in a line, and it's trees or shrubs or both. And it has to be more than 20 metres long. And the one hopefully you can see in the image there is a good few hundred metres long. So we're good on that part of it. So more than 20 metres long, but less than 5 metres wide. So it does need to be a line. And once you start to get over that 5 metres, you start to think, well, is this actually more of a woodland or a scrubby area? And you kind of lose that linearness of a hedgerow. So over 20 metres long, less than 5 metres wide. And if there are any gaps, they need to be less than 20 metres. So if you have a gap where there's a stile, so people can cross, or there might be a field gate for a farmer to gain access, that's fine, that's still classed as the same hedgerow. But if the gaps are more than 20 metres, then you're looking at a new stretch of hedgerow. So that's a hedgerow, a boundary line of trees or shrubs, more than 20 metres long, less than 5 metres wide, and with less than 20 metres in terms of gaps. But you may be asking yourself, what makes a good hedgerow? You probably see lots of hedgerows in all different situations when you're out and about, maybe some in the garden, maybe some in the farmland, alongside parks. But what makes a good hedgerow? Well, we start off by looking at the height of a hedgerow. And a tall hedgerow generally is better. So we're looking at a height of over 1.3 metres. And then you're starting to say this is a good hedgerow. It needs a decent amount of height. The width, less than 5 metres. So as we said, that was the definition of a hedgerow. Anything more than that, and it just isn't a hedgerow anymore. So you don't want it to be kind of really wide out into the habitat either side, the hedgerow itself. And then the shape of the hedgerow, I've kind of put this A shape illustration up, which I hope you can see okay. And this is the classic idea that a hedgerow, a really good hedgerow, will have this kind of A shape. If you imagine this is looking at a cross section of the hedgerow. So if you're looking at it end on, you see that the base is really wide. So this is wide and thick, and then it will taper up to the kind of the top, so it gets narrower as you go up the hedgerow. And this is the classic A shape that is thought to be the best kind of shape for a hedgerow. Now, the fact that my diagram is very, very much straight lines, obviously a hedgerow out in the countryside wouldn't be in such straight lines unless it had been really harshly managed. And we'll talk about that a bit later in the presentation about hedgerow management. But so it'll be a bit straggly. There'll be some bushier bits, but in general, the shape of a good hedgerow is nice and dense and wide at the bottom and potentially tapering a little bit to the top. And a good hedgerow has connections. So it's not just about the hedgerow itself. It has connections up into other hedgerows. So if we have a hedgerow that's isolated and not connected at all, then that reduces the value of it. But if it's connected up to a wider network, then that will increase the value of that hedgerow for wildlife. In terms of species, we'll talk about which ones they might be in the second half of the presentation. But for a really good hedgerow, you're looking at 5 or more different species along a length of hedgerow. So if a hedgerow is just one species, that's not necessarily terrible, but what would make it better is if there's a mix of species. So you've got that diversity in different species, providing slightly different things. So some might be better shelter, they might be denser, some might be providing different kind of berries, so different food availability, just different branch structures, which might be better for nesting or for foraging for particular species. So it's good to have a range of different species. And then it's good to have some associated features. So these are the add-on bits that will kind of make a good hedgerow even better. So what am I talking about when I say associated features? Well, it could be a wall associated with the hedgerow. So it depends where you are. You might find that actually the hedgerow's got a wall running along with it, and that can provide some extra nooks and crannies for all sorts of species. It might be up on a bank, and this might provide some different burrowing habitat. And there might be a ditch associated with it, running along one or both sides, and that ditch might be wet or dry, and it might have some vegetation associated with it. So all these things add value. And it's important in terms of the width of the hedgerow that anything up to 2.5 metres from the centre point of the hedgerow is classed as part of that hedgerow. So if it's further away than that, it's not classed as being part of the hedgerow, but if it's within that 2.5 metres from the centre point, then it's classed as an associated feature and part of that hedgerow. Another thing that can add value is it's actually if you had 2 hedgerows running parallel, and you might see this on the old sort of green lanes. If you're out and about walking, you kind of realise you're walking between 2 hedgerows. Effectively what this does is it doubles up your habitat. So you've got these 2 corridors running alongside each other. So you've got that kind of additional connectivity. So that's another really good marker for a good hedgerow if you've got the 2 parallel ones. And then lastly, if it has any trees associated with it. So we call them standard trees, but essentially you've got the hedgerow managed to a certain height, And then you allow some of the species to grow into proper trees, standard trees, and this provides some additional habitat. In the photo there, you can kind of see towards the distance there are a few taller trees associated with this particular hedgerow. So when you put all of these things together, that's what you're looking at for a good hedgerow. And not every hedgerow will have all of these, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not valuable for wildlife if you don't have lots of features or lots of connections. But ideally, you have as much of this as possible, and then you get kind of the best joint kind of function from the hedgerow. So that's the structure of the hedgerow. And I thought it'd be really interesting just to have a little look at a map of where some of our really best hedgerows are across Leicestershire and Rutland. And this is a very tiny map, and I will post a link afterwards that will take you to the document so you can zoom in a little bit. But those little blue dots are the distribution of our species-rich hedgerows in Leicestershire and Rutland. So this is our absolutely very best hedgerows that have got those number of species with them, or they've got lots of associated features with them. And you can see they're fairly spread out across the counties, but what they're not is really connected up. And they may be some less valuable hedgerows connecting those really important hedgerows. But what we'd really like to see is those blue lines connected up, the dots all joined together, and just more of them on the map. Now, these are the ones that have been able to be surveyed, and this is data from 2016. So actually that's 5 years ago now, but this is the most up-to-date information we have. What we would hope is that perhaps in the Charnwood Forest area, as a result of this project, we might be able to get some people who are confident to survey hedgerows and can go out, add some more blue lines to this map, and find out if there are more species-rich hedgerows out there that we'd really like to know about. Okay, what are hedgerows for? So we're talking a little bit now about hedgerow function. So we've talked about structure, and we're moving on to a little bit about the hedgerow function. So you may think initially of some traditional uses for hedgerows. So a field boundary. We started off talking about boundaries, didn't we? So a field boundary, stock proofing. So actually you plant a hedgerow and it keeps your cattle in, stops them getting out. The one in the picture here has also got a fence, so that's a bit of a belt and braces approach. But so keeping stock in or stock out, depending on what your requirement is. Shelter. So if you've got a good hedgerow, then actually any livestock in there are able to shelter out of the worst of the weather. And soil erosion is kind of linked to shelter. So you're kind of using the hedgerow as a wind barrier. And if you've got an arable field instead of a pasture field there, then actually having a really good hedgerow will trap any soil that, if it's bare and really windy, it will stop the soil from disappearing off your field. So lots of potential uses from a traditional perspective. But that's not all. That's not the only reason why we as conservationists are really interested in our hedgerows, because they have such a wider value in terms of nature. And so I'm kind of going to run through a few of the what I would class nature-based functions of a hedgerow, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you might not have thought about. So we talked a little bit about connections and making sure that hedgerows are connected up and how that is good for wildlife. So yeah, a wildlife corridor means that species that like to use hedgerows to move around without being spotted, out of sight of predators. If the hedgerow is connected up, then you've got this continuous wildlife corridor for lots of species. The hedgerow in itself is habitat on its own, good for some species, for breeding birds, obviously, for foraging, so we've mentioned about the berries, and just for taking shelter generally over kind of the winter or just kind of day to day. They're these dense, bushy, thick kind of structures where something can hide away and be safe from predators. Hedgerows have a value in terms of our pollinators, and you may have heard about some of the reports about how actually our pollinators are not doing very well for a variety of reasons. But hedgerows and hedgerow shrub species will flower, and you may think, oh, you think pollinators are more associated with wildflowers, but actually there's lots of pollinators that are associated with more shrubby species and rely on those for great sources of nectar. So pollinators really can take advantage of a good hedgerow. And the pollinators will also then potentially go into the field. So if you've got a field of crops, actually having a really good hedgerow will help support the pollinators when there is no crop. But once you have your crop in there, your pollinators can move into the field and pollinate your crops. Associated with that, natural pest control. So if you've got some species like ladybirds, maybe in the hedgerow, that will then be able to munch on any pests that you don't want in your field. So it's a natural way of a natural resource for pest control, and potentially could reduce the need to use pesticides. Air quality, it's possible, and then if you've got a hedgerow perhaps next to a road, that it can help to buffer the impact of that any road pollution. So if it's a nice dense hedgerow, will actually be helping to filter out some of the pollution that might be coming from road vehicles. Water regulation. So hedgerows and hedgerow shrubs will be using water, will be using essentially more water than around, and kind of locking that up and helping water to not necessarily flow across the landscape too quickly. So there's a real part to play for good hedgerows in regulating water and potentially slowing flood water down, but also kind of taking that up and helping to make the fields kind of potentially drain and take up the water that might otherwise be lying on the land, make it less easy to work. Carbon sequestration, and that's a long-term, just basically means there will be carbon, there will be living matter locked up in a hedgerow, both above and below ground. And one of the really important things in terms of our changing climate is that we need to reduce our carbon emissions. And so having more vegetation can lock up more carbon, but we need to maintain these hedgerows. We need to keep them. If they are removed for any reason, then any of the carbon that was locked up will be released. When we do manage hedgerows and trim them, that does release some carbon, but then if we allow them to grow back, it will kind of recapture that carbon. So there's a bit of a cycle there. But the base of your hedgerow, if you're planting a new hedgerow, you will be locking up more carbon than if you didn't have a hedgerow there. And then finally, there's the potential to use the trimmings when you're managing your hedgerow as a biofuel. So depending on what species and how you manage it, there's potential to use that byproduct of having these great hedgerows in the landscape as a way of producing biofuel. And I've talked a bit about hedgerows in the landscape, and I just wanted to illustrate that with this image from Google Earth. And hopefully what you can see there is a bit of an illustration of a principle that was first proposed by Professor Sir John Lawton. He wrote a report for government in 2010 called Making Space for Nature. And in it, he identified that what we need, what nature needs, is more of these core sites, so perhaps more of these blocks of woodland or heathland habitat that you can see on the map there. And we need them to be bigger, we need them to be better, and we need them to be more joined up, so more connected. And that's really where hedgerows have this really important part to play as a landscape corridor. And hopefully you can see that there's hedgerows joining up the blocks of other habitat, the blocks of woodland there. And from the map, hopefully you can see it looks like there are some standard trees within those hedgerows. You can see the little blobs. So that's an illustration of what I was talking about in terms of structure. But it's a way that species can move across the landscape without having to cross big, vast, open, empty fields. And all the other associated benefits that we've got with hedgerows. So bigger, better, and more joined up. And hedgerows are brilliant for that more joined up function. Poor hedgerow structure, and it doesn't mean that the hedgerow won't have any value for wildlife, but these three images just illustrate where a hedgerow is perhaps not as healthy or not providing some of those functions that we would hope. So the top one there, kind of the term that I would use is it's quite leggy. So the trees look as though they've grown up tall, but there's not a lot at the base of the hedgerow, so it's not very dense. There's some gaps in there. It will be providing some structure for some species, but it doesn't really provide that thick, bushy, dense structure. The line of hedgerows in the middle there, the hedgerows themselves are more dense and more bushy, but there's lots of gaps. So there's no connectivity in that hedgerow. And then the hedgerow at the bottom, this one doesn't have gaps, so it's a lovely, continuous, bushy hedgerow, but it's not very tall, and there's no real variety in the height. It looks like it's been trimmed very, very neatly, but doesn't give that height variety that we might want. So there's pros and cons of different things, but they will all have some value. But ideally, it would be great if we could get more hedgerows that are more continuous, more bushy, to provide that kind of really dense, well-vegetated corridor for wildlife to move through the landscape. Where have all the hedgerows gone? Across the landscape, we don't have as many hedgerows as we used to. And some figures released recently suggest that we may have lost 50% of our hedgerows since the Second World War. And this is due to a number of reasons. Direct losses, change in management, use of pesticides has had an impact. So some hedgerows were grubbed out to make space for larger fields, larger machinery, and increased efficiency of farming. And it's understandable with the pressure to produce more food more efficiently that potentially you might see the hedgerows in the way of that. But the good news is that has largely stopped. Our hedgerow amount of hedgerow we can see in the county now is largely stable and potentially increasing slightly, which is great, because over 10% of UK priority species are significantly associated with hedgerows. So our priority species, the ones we're really concerned about, over 10% of those use hedgerows, so it's a really important habitat for them. The latest figure I could find for how much hedgerow we have got in Leicestershire and Rutland from 2003 is nearly 17,000 kilometres, which seems like quite a lot. But let me just show you what has happened potentially in certain areas. So if you can see this little illustration here with the green lines on, this is a trace of boundaries, hedgerow boundaries from the late 1800s. So I found an old map, and again, I'll send the link round. It's at the bottom of the page there, but I will send that round. If you're interested in old maps, it's a really great website. So you can zoom in and see what the landscape used to look like in the late 1800s. But what I found was when I then looked at the difference between that and a more recent aerial image, I found that a lot of these hedgerows between the late 1800s and up to the early 2000s, a lot of the hedgerows had disappeared. And in fact, almost a mile, 1.6 kilometres of hedgerow disappeared just in this little tiny pocket. So where we are now in terms of hedgerows is not perhaps where we used to be, and hopefully the tide has turned on any further losses. But what we've got left, we absolutely need to make sure is in tip-top condition, managed as best as it can be, and potentially look for opportunities to increase hedgerow. So hedgerow protection, so this is really key. So I talked about the losses since the Second World War and how that's now largely stabilised, due in part to the hedgerow regulations. So this is where we started at the start of the presentation. The Hedgerow Regulations 1997 define what a hedgerow is and also define how they are protected. And the hedgerow protection is reliant on its length, its location, and its importance. And that's importance as defined by the regulations. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail because it's quite complicated. But ultimately, if your hedgerow is over 20 metres or is connected to a hedgerow that is over 20 metres, if it's located in the wider countryside, so if its adjacent land use is largely agricultural, so this doesn't apply to hedgerows that are within the curtilage of a dwelling, so your kind of more urban garden hedgerows that are not included. But if it's long enough and it's in the wider countryside, then we consider whether it is important. And that includes specifications about how old it is. Is it over 30 years? Does it have particular biodiversity interest? Does it support protected species? Or is it particularly species rich? So there's quite a lot of factors in that importance. And if somebody now wants to remove a hedgerow, they have to apply to the local planning authority. And the local planning authority will consider these things about length, location and importance, and they can issue a hedgerow retention notice, and they can say, no, you may not remove this hedgerow. Alternatively, they may decide that it doesn't qualify as important under the regulations and can allow it to be removed. They may then say, actually, yes, you can remove this, but we require you to plant an equal length of hedgerow perhaps elsewhere. So hopefully that is more positive. Many of our hedgerows are being retained, whereas they might have been lost in the past. And there are opportunities for replanting hedgerow and a slightly contentious issue of new development. Often new developments will actually contribute to adding hedgerow into the wider countryside. So there are ways where it can be increased, but certainly, hopefully, not decreased to the extent that we've seen in the past. Hedgerow management, if you're wondering about how we should manage our hedgerows and what's the best time and when, kind of how best to do it. So the rule of thumb, or the rule of 3, is the best thing to think about if you've got a hedgerow of your own or somebody's asking you about how to manage a hedgerow. And what this basically means is we're trying to suggest to people that you don't necessarily manage the whole hedgerow every year. So you don't give it a short back and sides absolutely every year without fail. This is not the most beneficial thing for the hedgerow. If you take the rule of 3, it means you cut the top or one of the sides each year. So in the illustration there, you take the left-hand side in year 1, you trim the top in year 2, and the right-hand side in year 3. And then in year 4, you go back to the first side. And in year 5, back to the top, and in year 6, back to the third side. So if you can see, that's what we mean by on rotation. And actually, it's a good rule of thumb for most habitat work, most conservation work, is try not to cut up all of your habitat every year. If you can leave a third or 2/3 uncut every year, it's just more beneficial. It gives more space for different species. In terms of hedgerow management, flowering and fruiting is usually on the 2-year-old growth. So if you cut it every year, you remove or reduce the opportunity for the species to flower and fruit, which removes that resource. In terms of timing, the best time to manage hedgerows is in late winter. It means you avoid the bird breeding season over the summer, but you maintain some berries available throughout kind of the worst of the winter. So January, February time is the time to really focus on hedgerow management, making sure you stop well in advance of the bird breeding season in March, sometimes a bit earlier, so it does depend on the year, and it depends on what species you've got around. But there's a small window of opportunity, and hopefully if you're only doing part of a hedgerow each year, there's not such an onerous task to get it done at that time of year. Gapping up is another important part of hedgerow management. So if you've got some areas that there are gaps, using native species, making sure you protect them so they can establish and become part of the hedgerow is really important. And you can also use a technique called laying or layering, hedge laying. You may have heard of this. And you can see on the image, hopefully there, this hedgerow has been laid in the past. At the front by the fence there, if you can see, there's some kind of horizontal branches. And this is evidence that at some point in the past, this hedgerow was laid. So each of the upright stems was almost cut through and laid over. But a lot of the hedgerow species are brilliant because they have the ability to kind of regenerate. As long as you don't cut the stem completely, they can regenerate. And then you get this really dense bushy structure at the bottom. But it does still need management. And as you can see in this picture, there are still gaps in this hedgerow and it's not looking brilliant. And it needs a fence to help it out in terms of making it stock proof. So laying a hedgerow is brilliant, but you still do need to then manage it in an ongoing fashion to make sure it maintains that value for wildlife. So locally native hedgerow species. This is the list from the criteria for local wildlife site designation. And for those of you that are not familiar with a local wildlife site, these are areas that are identified at county level as being really important for wildlife. They don't have statutory protection, but a lot of conservation organisations are involved in going out and surveying and finding out where our best sites are. And for hedgerows, to meet the criteria to be classified as a local wildlife site hedgerow, it must contain 6 or more of these species on this list. And that's an average length of 30 metres. So we will go through in future sessions how to do a hedgerow survey and exactly how to measure it and how to work out the average, etc. But for today, a local wildlife site hedgerow must contain 6 or more of these species, or 5 species plus at least 2 associated features. So hopefully you remember I talked about associated features being things like ditches or walls or standard trees. So either the hedgerow has 6 or more of these species, so it's really species rich, or if it only has 5 of them, but it does have at least 2 associated features, it can be classed as a local wildlife site. So there's some highlighted there that are some of the key ones, and we're going to be going through some of those as we talk about the different species within the hedgerow. So I thought we'd kick off with Hawthorn. And this is a species that will make up the bulk of our native hedgerows out in the wider countryside. If you're out there, you're driving around and you're driving past a hedgerow, you're going for your walk through the fields and you're walking along a hedgerow, the chances are that common hawthorn or Crataegus monogyna will be the majority of that hedgerow, potentially up to 60% or so. And you can recognise hawthorn because the leaves are these 3-lobed leaves. They're quite deeply divided and quite small leaves. They've got this deep division, which you can see I've pointed to with the arrow there. They have thorns, as the name suggests. They're one of the thorny species. And the thorns are quite short and they're on the shoots. So beware if you're going through, it'll catch hold of you if you're doing any management. They're quite sharp and spiky, but the thorn is on a side shoot. And in the winter, you'll see these red berries, these red hawthorn berries. These come after the flowers, and the flowers are usually white, and they appear in spring after the leaves have come out. So a hawthorn hedgerow, if you're looking at it, will look like this in spring. So you'll see the green flush of leaves, and you will see the white flowers associated with it. I'll show you the other species that will kind of work in the opposite way in a moment. So that's hawthorn, common hawthorn. You may also find some cultivated varieties. So some people talk about mayflower, may trees. So you might see some more of the pinkier flowers around. So they might be more of a cultivated as opposed to the native variety. And you may also find Midland hawthorn, as the name suggests, in the Midlands. This is much less widely distributed than common hawthorn, but a good way to check and see if you think you've got Midland hawthorn is actually, if you take a look at the berry itself, and if you squish it in your fingers, inside a common hawthorn, you'll find 1 seed, and inside a Midland hawthorn, you'll find more than 1 seed, possibly 2 or 3. So that's common hawthorn, Crataegus monogyna, so mono meaning 1. But Midland hawthorn will have more than 1 seed, and you can find those in the berries. So yeah, and the white flowers in spring appear after the leaves, which is good to remember. So the next species, the next thorny species, is blackthorn or Prunus spinosa. So the Prunus is the plum family, and this is most readily identified if you're out and about and you find some sloes, or these little tiny looking plum-looking fruits. So there's these purple-black small fruits, and are out in abundance now. If you've been out and about, you might have spotted them. I certainly did at the weekend and started looking up recipes for making sloe gin. So sloes, and some people call it the sloe bush, but it's blackthorn. Now, if we look at the bottom right there, the leaves of the blackthorn haven't got the 3 lobes like hawthorn. They're more of a simple leaf structure. And if you draw a line down the middle and we'll kind of cut it into quarters, you'll notice that the leaves are wider towards the top of the leaf than they are towards the stem. And that's a good way to have to look and see if it's blackthorn. And there are little tiny jagged teeth all around the edge of the leaf. So you've got more of a simple leaf structure than hawthorn. It's widest above the midpoint. At this time of year, you might be looking out for purple-black sloes. What you will find with blackthorn is that in spring you get white flowers, and these appear before the leaves. So if you're walking along, even at a distance, instead of seeing the hedgerow that we just saw the image of from hawthorn, which was the green with the white flowers, what you'll find is you'll just see sort of a dark twiggy hedgerow with just the white flowers kind of springing out. It's almost like this little white froth has appeared within the twiggy kind of wintry look of the hedgerow. I think it looks absolutely beautiful, but that's likely to be blackthorn, where the flowers have appeared before the leaves. And then I guess the final thing to say about blackthorn is it is thorny, but the thorns are actually on the end of the shoots. So you'll see hopefully in the middle picture there, we've got a stem coming up and then some branches kind of coming off at angles. And the thorn, the really sharp spine, is at the end of those branches, at the end of those side shoots. So that's different from the hawthorn, where the thorn is actually directly on the side shoot. And so that's another way of telling the different thorn species apart. If you perhaps can't see the leaves, can't see the flowers or the fruits, is the arrangement of the spines. And we will be talking a bit more. I think it'll be the December session, if you're interested, that we'll be talking about how to identify different species of tree and shrub in winter, when you haven't got leaves, and when you haven't got fruits, and when you haven't got flowers. And so we're looking more about arrangement of spines and bark and buds, So that's one for future reference and to note to look out for if you're interested in how to identify some of these species in the winter. So moving on to the next species that you'll often see in our hedgerows, and this one's field maple, or Acer campestre. So it is the maple family, and it's Acer, like other, and maybe you might be familiar if you're a gardener. There are some really pretty Japanese maple trees that give a really frilly leaf. But the native Acer is the Acer campestre, or the field maple. And these have 5-lobed leaves with few rounded teeth, so it's a very rounded kind of leaf shape. And I almost spot this one from a distance because they're quite almost yellowy green, quite a pale yellowy green. And to my mind, the stalk of the leaf has quite a reddy, pinky colour. Maybe you can just sort of make that out on the photo. It's quite difficult to take a photo of. But so if you're looking at quite small leaves, much, much smaller, if you're familiar with a sycamore, these are much smaller than a sycamore, although similar shaped because they're in the Acer family. Much smaller. It's a kind of a smaller shrub to tree. A sycamore is much more robust, much bigger. When the bark is young, it's quite a bright brown colour, but when it's older, it goes what we call corky. So it's a bit like a wine cork. It's got that kind of slightly rough, squidgy, soft texture. And hopefully you can see the image on the top left there, just of a trunk of a slightly older part of the field maple tree, and it's got those lines in it. It's kind of, if you look up close, they're quite deeply ridged. The buds on it are small opposite buds, so if you're looking at the leaf arrangement on the branch, you'll find that the leaves are coming off opposite each other. So they're not alternative, they're not spiraling, they're opposite each other. And you can see from the bottom right there, so where the leaf attaches to the stalk, there's one on either side. And we'll talk more about opposite and adjacent and spiraling leaf buds when we go into our winter tree ID session in a couple of months' time. Field maple does have keys or fruit, so it does have the classic Acer helicopter winged fruits. I apologise, I didn't manage to get an image of one. I couldn't find one out there at the moment. We're a bit too early. But so different to the sycamore, where the wings are kind of droopy. The wings of the field maple are horizontal, and so you've got a very horizontal kind of helicopter wings rather than the drooping down wings of something like a sycamore. So that's your field maple. The next kind of shrubby species you might recognise is elder, or Sambucus nigra. This is actually in the honeysuckle family, and it has compound leaves. So for the first time, we're moving away from a single leaf and excuse me, what you find is there are leaflets. So you may think, oh, this has got 5 leaves, that picture in the middle, but actually it has 5 leaflets. So each of those leaves leaflets together makes up the whole leaf. And they're in opposite pairs apart from the one on the end, which means you get 5 or 7 leaflets on a compound leaf of an elder. It's quite a straggly kind of bush. It's one you can really almost identify at the moment if you're wandering around. There's just lots of really straggly, fragile looking branches. If you look deeper at the bigger trunks, you'll see they're a bit like on the left there. Again, this corky bark, but with these kind of dots up and down the bark. You may know elderflower wine, and you may know elderberry wine. So the picture in the bottom there shows the elderberries, clusters of tiny black shiny berries on these kind of reddish pinky red stalks, and they follow the white frothy clusters of flowers that you get kind of in the spring and summer. As opposed to the ash, I've just put a little comparison shot in the bottom right there. So the elder has the 5 to 7 leaflets. If you're not sure, there's another compound leaf there, but if it's got more like 11 or 13 little leaflets, you're looking at an ash tree, so do count them up. And the ash, if you take a step back, will be much bigger and much kind of bolder tree. And we'll talk about the buds of an ash. So if you're in any doubt, you can often spot ash buds being very dark black, and we'll go into more detail about that again in the winter ID. But that's an idea for giving you an idea of an elder tree that you're likely to see in our hedgerows. Next up is hazel, and this is a really nice tree. You probably won't ever see hazelnuts. You might if you're lucky, but the chances are squirrels will come along and get them before you get to spot them. But I have put a picture of one in the bottom right there. What you might see really quite early in the year is the catkins, the yellow male catkins drooping down. And if you tap them, you often get this cloud of yellow pollen being released. The leaves are quite wide, quite an apple green, very serrated, and they're what we call cordate at the base. And this means that where the stalk meets the base of the leaf, you've got that little V shape, that little V indentation, and that's cordate. And we'll go through some more of those terms again when we talk about winter tree ID. If you do see the buds, flattened green oval buds, if you're out and about in the winter, that's what you're looking for. Sometimes or often, hazel will be multi-stemmed. It's one of those ones in our woodlands that historically would have been coppiced, and you use hazel poles that come out once a kind of hazel has been cut back. These sort of smaller poles will come out, and they're really quite straight, and they're used for all sorts of things. Hazel hurdles, they're used for binding the top of a laid hedgerow. So it's got loads and loads of uses, and often you will see it as this kind of multi-stemmed bush, and that's a sign that it has been cut back in the past and it's regrown from the base. So that's hazel, which is Corylus avellana. Now this is a tree that you will probably see more as a tree than a shrub, and often in somewhere that's a bit wetter or a bit damper. And this is the alder, or Oldness Glutenosa, and this one has similar at first glance leaves to a hazel, in that they're rounded, but these have blunt ends, never pointed, and hopefully you can see that in the image. Actually, these are almost indented as well, they're almost the other way, and they're very dark green and much more robust. They feel like kind of more shiny, more leathery than a hazel. They also have catkins, so the male catkins are green and they turn red in the winter, but the female catkins are actually turned into woody cones. So in the picture on the left, you can see the female catkins are those green cone-shaped structures, and then they turn into little tiny brown cones when they ripen. So you've got male catkins and female catkins different in an older tree. If you do see the buds, and actually you can see the buds at this time of year, kind of coming through already. I always think they look a bit like a boxing glove, and that's how I've remembered alder. You've got this club-shaped red-purple bud that's sort of got that curve to it. And as I said, wet areas, stream sides, river banks, that's where you're likely to find alder. Common dogwood is another shrub species that's present, and actually you probably see this as a planted species as well, with quite a few cultivated varieties if you're just out and about in a more urban habitat, but you will find it in our hedgerows. The leaves are quite oval in opposite pairs, so the same as the field maple. You're looking at a pair of leaves opposite each other on the stem. The veins of the dogwood are very curved. I hope you can see that on the picture on the right hand side there. The veins kind of curve round the edge of the leaf and then go back into the top. New shoots on dogwood are often this bright red colour, and that's quite visible, particularly in the winter. The leaves probably will turn red-purple in the autumn as you start to get towards kind of autumn-winter time. Dogwood does have flowers. They're white and they're followed by some small black berries. Another dog, but this is dog rose this time, which is Rosa canina. Aggregate just means that there are many very, very similar species of Rosa canina, so they've all been grouped together. And so this is what you would see as dog rose out in the countryside. The photo on the left there, I hope, sort of illustrates, often you're wandering along and you see these really strongly arching stems. So they're going from the base all the way up and droop over. Usually if there's buds, kind of the dog rose, the rose hips that are kind of weighting it down at the top. But you get this really strongly arching stem covered in, really thick covered in spines, arching over at the top. And the thing to do is to look closely at those spines, and they have a really broad base. So compared to other species, the base of that prickle is really broad and it curves around. And the way I've always remembered it is a bit like if you're a pet owner and have a dog, they have these dew claws which are quite curved. So that's why I've always gone, right, a curved spine is related to dog rose, and that's kind of just how I remember that. The leaves, again, we're talking about leaflets. 2 to 3 pairs of toothed leaflets, 5 to 7 in total. You will see large white or pale pink flowers, and then you'll get the shiny red rose hips. So note of caution that roses are very variable and there is lots of hybridization. So if what you're looking at doesn't look quite right, don't worry. could be a hybrid species, and there are a few other roses out there. But if you're looking at something that looks like this, chances are it's dog rose. If you've got something that's spiky, but the spikes don't have that broad base, the chances are you're looking at bramble, and you may be able to spot blackberries on it as well, so that will give you a hint. Excuse me. Right, Gelder Rose. This is one you may or may not be familiar with. It's certainly something that I don't see as often when I'm out and about, but a really nice species. The leaves have 3 lobes, a bit like a hawthorn, but they're all sort of pointing to the end. They're not so deeply divided. They are sharply toothed, and they turn a very yellowy red colour in autumn. The flowers are white, umbel-like flower heads, and that just means if you know something like cow parsley, it has that flat-topped, almost upside-down umbrella look to it. And so the flowers are like that on Gelder Rose. And then you get globular, slightly translucent, shiny red berries, hopefully really well illustrated in this picture. They almost look as though they're just slightly see-through, very, very shiny. Stems of Gelder Rose are greyish, hairless. The buds green and hairless, and they're adpressed to the stem. So that means the bud is actually nestled up really closely to the stem. It doesn't stick out. A bit like alder, this one likes damp habitats. So this is one you're likely to see, but it might take a bit more spotting. You have to be out and about quite a bit before you spot one of these. Some other hedgerow species. So in terms of local wildlife site criteria, we're looking at very much woody species, and species-rich hedgerows that I talked about at the very start again is about woody species. But that doesn't mean that other hedgerow species aren't valuable and won't form part of many of our hedgerows. So I've just picked 3 here. Ivy is a really, really key part of hedgerows. And it doesn't count towards the species richness, but it is still an important factor. And it has these shiny green leaves. It also has kind of these sort of green flowers. And sometimes you don't realise that that's actually an ivy flower, and they turn into these globular clusters of black berries. And I don't know about you, but when I'm wandering about at the moment, ivy is pretty much the only thing that is in flower now. And the bees are just going mad. They're all around it, they're swarming around it. It's that really important late source of nectar. Honeysuckle is a great species, that's the native honeysuckle. And then also at the bottom, wild clematis, or traveller's joy, you might know it as, or old man's beard. And that the kind of seed pods ripen to this kind of fluffy, long-stalked, fluffy look, Clematis vitalba. So there's some sort of shrubby hedgerow species that are really important components of the hedgerow, and good to know, but don't necessarily count towards the richness of a hedgerow if we're looking to see how important it is for local wildlife site criteria, or in terms of the overall richness and structure of the hedgerow. Okay, so that was a whistle-stop tour through 12 different species. I've tried not to overload you too much at this stage, because we've talked quite a lot about hedgerows in general as well. Hopefully it's given you a flavour of the structure and the function of a hedgerow, what we're looking for in terms of species, and a starting point. And the spotter sheet will have all of those kind of hints and tips in terms of ID on it, and you can download that. There's a couple of other really good publications that are available for free online. You can have a read at your leisure about healthy hedgerows and hedgerow management. The Field Studies Council, or FSC chart, is brilliant for hedgerows. It gives some of the main species, and it talks about some of the other associated species, so not just the vegetation, but the birds and the small mammals and butterflies that you might spot as well. So there's quite a lot of resource out there. And I'll leave you to have a look at some of those at your leisure, and I will, as before, send around the links. So we're on to the Q&A session, which with 10 minutes to go till 2 o'clock, hopefully that will work nicely. I'm just going to unshare my screen, and then hopefully I'll be able to pick up the chat. I can see there are 5 messages in there. So I shall run down these first, and then if anybody's got any other questions, then they are welcome to unmute, and we can see if there's anything else that needs answering. So I've had a comment about structure, stock retention and laying hedges to keep them dense. Yes, absolutely. Hopefully we talked a little bit about that, that the denser and the bushier they are, you'll be able to keep your stock in, and laying, I think we did cover that as well. And bats using hedges as guides to navigation. Absolutely, that is something that I didn't talk about. So as a wildlife corridor, it's not just the species that are within the hedgerow, but yeah, absolutely, bats will use them to help guide their journey across the landscape. Obviously, they'll be flying above the hedgerow. So Carol, we have a hedgerow in our ordering our allotments. The hawthorn's being overwhelmed with ivy. Should we cut it back to allow the hawthorn to flourish more? What to do? It's tricky. I would suggest if you feel that the hawthorn is being completely overwhelmed, you can maybe think about managing some of it, but certainly not all of it. So it's trying to maintain that balance of a bit of everything if you can. So maybe you would cut a little bit of it on one side, maybe a third, just cut back to allow the hawthorn to come through and try and have a bit of both. Jane, we are having difficulty arguing for hedgerows in edge of town development. Any help to fight those decisions appreciated. Yes, I think I said very briefly about development and the potential for removal of hedgerows and replacement. If you've got specific examples or specific applications you're concerned about, do get in touch with the Wildlife Trust and we can see if we can offer some advice. It's usually on a sort of a case-by-case basis rather than being able to give general advice, because each planning application will be different. But if the hedgerow is adjacent to an agricultural field, then it should be, they should be looking at retaining it. Because if something's going through the planning process, that's sort of subject to slightly different regulations. So you might not be able to argue through the hedgerow regulations, but you would certainly be able to argue in terms of loss of biodiversity, that a development should be looking to retain hedgerows within it wherever possible. And if not, certainly replacing and kind of improving any other hedgerows that are around the site. It is tricky, and I can't comment. If you've got a specific problem, then do get in touch and we'll see if we can offer any more specific advice on that. If you see a few trees in a row across a field, invariably it indicates where a hedgerow has been removed. That's brilliant. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, often you can see those remnant lines of hedgerows and there's just a few trees left. So there could be, if the landowner was willing, the opportunity to look at whether you could reinstate that hedgerow. It's tricky, as with anything, when you're persuading people to make changes in the landscape. But if you do spot that, and you know the landowner and you have a chat with them, if they're thinking, oh, actually we might be willing to do that, then that would be a really worthwhile thing to look at. Obviously having a look at what's gone on since the hedgerows perhaps deteriorated or been removed, and to find out what the current land use is and what species are there, and make sure that whatever you were proposing to do wouldn't impact on what's there at the moment. Let me just see if there's any more going down. I think that's the bottom for me of the messages that I can see. Has anybody else got any questions or anything else they would like to comment or say about hedgerows or the project in general?
Yeah, I might just add something. I'm on the planning committee, the local authority. Most local authorities at the moment are going through the process of creating their local plans, which sets their stall out for 5, 7 or 9 years. And a lot of smaller units are preparing neighbourhood plans. It's good to get involved with them and ensure that those plans include something along the lines of retaining the hedgerows, because that forms part of the planning process, and in cases coming forward, they have to bear them in mind then.
Brilliant, thank you, Roy. Yes, in terms of the planning process, the earlier you can get involved, absolutely the better. So if it's at the earliest level, when your local or your borough council is looking at its planning, and then absolutely when maybe your parish council is looking at a neighbourhood plan, definitely that's the time to get in and try and get something in writing then in policy that talks about hedgerow retention. And then if individual applications come through, then you've got something to go back to and say, right, well, the overall plan says this, and that gives you some more ammunition. Absolutely. Has anybody else got any questions? Okay. I'm not seeing, I'm just best check. So I realise we've got two groups of people now. Okay. Well, if nobody else has got any questions, I will finish off the session today. Thank you very much for joining. I do hope it was interesting and enjoyable. As ever, I will be sending round links to recordings and bits and pieces. If it's not this week, don't worry. It just take us a little bit of time to do the necessary background work to get it up on YouTube and get everything on our website ready for you. I will send around an email, but if in a week or 10 days or so you haven't had anything, then do let me know, and I will can send you out anything that you may have missed. Next session is in another month's time, and I think we're going to be looking at how to use a key, so a species identification key, and this is really important when you're starting to get into more detailed identification. So we'll be running through different sorts of keys, and if you've got a book that you use, maybe a wildflower book or a tree book, inside it you might find a key. So if you want to have a look before the next session and see if you can explore what that means, what key your book has, and hopefully we can take you through the different sorts of keys, how to use them, kind of pitfalls and things like that. So that'll be in probably 4 weeks' time, I think.
Could you email the link to Julie's little video as well, please?
Absolutely, yeah. I will send that round. Excuse me, I do apologise for the coughing fits at points today. I appear to have got a frog in my throat, which as a wildlife person shouldn't be too bad, but it's been a bit troublesome today. So lovely to see you all. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.